Hello everybody, welcome back to another video by Jay Bowman. Today I'm going to be talking about these two cameras. I have the Olympus EM1 Mark III and I have the OM system OM1 Mark II. The EM1 Mark III is a camera I've owned for more than 5 years and shot with extensively. Recently I acquired the OM system OM1 Mark II. And this is an update to my previous video on those two cameras, which I made about 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've been shooting both cameras extensively, including a week-long trip to Wales that I made recently when I was shooting both cameras alongside each other. So I now have a lot more experience of real-world use to update the comparison made in my previous video. I will say that I'm not a videographer, so I will not be comparing the video between these two cameras. I'm an amateur photographer who primarily uses my cameras to record everyday family life, so mostly portraits, plus a bit of travel, landscape, wildlife, and macro. I'm not sponsored by OM System and I'm not a professional photographer. There is very little content online comparing these cameras from that perspective, which is why I'm making this video. Hopefully this video will be useful for two groups of people. The first is people who are considering upgrading from the EM1 Mark III to the OM1 Mark II. That was my position before I bought this camera. If you have an EM1 Mark II or an EM5 Mark III, then you can probably also get some useful information here as well. The second group is people who don't currently have either camera and may be looking to get into Micro Four Thirds or OM system cameras for the first time. Hopefully both groups of people will find this video useful. My ideal comparison would compare these two cameras in three main areas. 1. The camera hardware, including the viewfinders. 2. The image quality. 3. The autofocus performance. Now, a video which would cover all of that in sufficient detail would be too long. Therefore, this video will focus only on the camera hardware. If there is enough demand, I may make the other two comparison videos in the future. Just briefly, I think the autofocus on the OM1 Mark II is better than on the EM1 Mark III, but I would need a longer video and a bit more experience to make a detailed comparison. I think in terms of image quality, there is no material difference. I have noticed a few instances where I think the image quality of the EM1 Mark III might actually be better than the OM1 Mark II. But again, I would need to do a longer video and have a bit more experience to go into this. Finally, in this introduction, I would say that this is not a technical comparison, and I will not be quoting specification like prices, weight, megapixels. All of that information is readily available online, and this video is my personal impression as a user of these two cameras. Where I have relevant information, photos and videos, I will put them on screen without necessarily mentioning this. So although usually my videos are meant to be listened to rather than watched, in this case it is worth watching along. Also, if this is your first time watching my channel, you should be aware that generally I talk about and play synthesizers on this channel, but occasionally I put up some content about cameras also. Let's get started with the comparison. Let's start this comparison between the hardware of the EM1 Mark III and the OM1 II by talking about the two most significant differences, the viewfinder and the dials. After that, I will talk about some of the other less significant differences. I will try to keep this comparison as succinct as possible. I could talk about the differences between these two cameras for hours. Okay, first, the viewfinder. Let's start with the first positive note. The OM1 Mark II viewfinder is better in almost every respect. It is more detailed and sharper, which makes it slightly easier to judge focus. Most importantly, it is larger, which means I shoot in different ways using the OM1 Mark II compared to the EM1 Mark III. In my EM1 Mark III, I shoot in what Olympus calls Style 3, which is where the image takes up the whole screen of the EVF, with shooting information overlaid on top of the image. That was to make the image as large as possible for me to see. Now on my OM1 Mark II, I shoot in what OM System calls Style 2, which is where the image takes up the top portion of the screen, but there is a small black bar at the bottom of the screen where the shooting information is displayed. I find that even using Style 2 on the OM1 Mark II, the viewfinder is so much larger than on the EM1 Mark III that I can have a separate area for my shooting information and still have a larger image in the viewfinder, which is great. The second positive is that OM System have solved the issue I mentioned in my previous video, where in heavy rain or in certain other conditions, the EM1 viewfinder would suffer from condensation and become essentially unusable. I shot in some extremely heavy rain in Wales, and after a while the EM1 Mark III viewfinder did start to fog up, but the OM1 Mark II viewfinder did not suffer from this issue. So this is another point in favour of the OM1 Mark II. So those are two big positives in favour of the OM1 Mark II. To set against that, there are just a few less significant negatives. The first negative, I've experienced a few instances with the OM1 Mark II viewfinder where it has struggled in transitioning from dark to bright conditions. The viewfinder overcompensates and goes extremely bright temporarily. This is an issue I've noticed in the field with the OM1 Mark II, which I don't recall ever experiencing with the EM1 Mark III. Now, I've just done some testing in the studio, and having stress tested both cameras by putting on and taking off the lens cap, I can see that both the EM1 Mark III and the OM1 Mark II viewfinders have the issue where they go extremely bright for a short period of time before they adjust to the light. However, the EM1 Mark III adjusts back down to normal brightness about twice as quickly as the OM1 Mark II. It's not a huge issue, but it is something you might notice if you're coming from the EM1 Mark III to the OM1 Mark II. Also, it affects the screen as well as the viewfinder, so it seems to be a sensor issue rather than a viewfinder issue. Now, let's talk about the second negative. Let me explain. I shoot with the screen protected at the back of the camera. Now, you will notice that the Olympus cameras do not have a top plate. I might be slightly unusual in that I will look through the viewfinder when I'm holding the camera at arm's length, mostly just to check the camera settings. But sometimes you can also shoot that way in a pinch. The EM1 Mark III works fine for that. The viewfinder is extremely clear when seen from this arm's length distance, and the shooting information is also clear. For some reason, the OM1 Mark II doesn't really work in this way. When holding the camera at arm's length, the viewfinder is harder to see, including the shooting information. Also, the refresh rate in the viewfinder drops significantly, and it makes a very jerky image. Now, you might think that you could solve that by holding your thumb over the eye sensor, but it's in such a position that I can't reach it one-handed, so that's not really an option for me. The final negative I've identified so far is that there is sometimes a difference between the image displayed in the OM1 Mark II viewfinder and the photo that the camera actually records. This is strange because I have image review turned on so that the photo is displayed in the viewfinder immediately after I take the photo, so the discrepancy is disconcerting. In one photo in particular, there was a difference between the colour temperature and brightness in the viewfinder and the photo. It's not a consistent problem and it's not a huge issue. It's only occurred a few times. So to sum up, the OM1 Mark II viewfinder is much better. When I was shooting in Wales, I thought the difference was even more significant. But when I got home, I realised that I needed to clean the viewfinder in my EM1 Mark III. And when I did that, all of a sudden the EM1 Mark III viewfinder became a lot easier to see than it had been previously. Also, it is noticeable that the OM1 Mark II viewfinder unit is bulkier than the EM1 Mark III viewfinder, which adds to the size of the OM1 Mark II. But still, overall, in terms of viewfinder, the OM1 Mark II is a clear improvement over the EM1 Mark III. Now let's talk about the dials. The EM1 Mark III dials are much better than the OM1 Mark II dials, and the EM1 Mark III dials are probably my favourite dials I've used on any camera. They are easily accessible and easy to turn, but I've never accidentally changed exposure using these dials. By contrast, the OM1 Mark II dials are recessed. They're harder to access and they're harder to turn. In Wales, I was shooting the EM1 Mark III and the OM1 Mark II in heavy rain, and I found on a few occasions that the OM1 Mark II dials were actually quite difficult to turn in those conditions. Despite the rubber coating on the dials, I found my finger sliding on the OM1 Mark II dials, and it also seemed that they had even more resistance to turning when they were wet. Whatever hand cream or whatever else you have on your hands gets onto the dials and carried around into the recess, along with rainwater. It's harder to clean the dials on the OM1 too, due to them being recessed, whereas the EM1 Mark III dials are almost self-cleaning because they are so open to the elements. Finally, on the dials, I should say that I'm suspicious of rubber coatings, as I've had several electronics goods where rubber coatings have deteriorated over a relatively short period of time. The EM1 III dials have held up very well over 5+ years, but I'm concerned that the OM1 Mark II dials will not last as long. So those are the most significant issues with the camera hardware. Let's run through some less significant issues more quickly. First point, the OM1 Mark II battery has more capacity. It takes longer to charge, but it also lasts longer in the field. When I was using the EM1 Mark III and the OM1 Mark II together, I was using the OM1 Mark II more intensively. I had the 12mm f2 on the EM1 Mark III. So let me show you how that looks. And then on the OM1 Mark II, I either had the 25mm f1.2 Pro lens, like that, or occasionally I was using the Sigma 150mm macro lens, sometimes with a ×2 teleconverter, as well as the adapter here. Even though I was shooting the OM1 Mark II more than the EM1 Mark III, and I was using it more intensively as well, the battery level that was remaining on both cameras stayed roughly level. So I think that shows how much bigger and better the OM1 Mark II battery is than the EM1 Mark III. The next point is the AF joystick. Now, although these joysticks look similar, I prefer the EM1 Mark III joystick. It's easier to access and easier to move. The joystick on the EM1 Mark III feels more prominent than on the OM1 Mark II. Also, it's much easier to get back to home position on the EM1 Mark III than on the OM1 Mark II. In the EM1 Mark III, any single press of the middle of the joystick resets the home position. On the OM1 Mark II, you have to first move the joystick and then press the middle of the joystick to reset to home position. I presume OM System made this change to avoid people inadvertently returning to AF home position, but this has not been an issue which has ever affected me in 5 years of using the EM1 Mark III. Now let's talk about the ports. To be very brief, the microphone jack placement is much better on the OM1 Mark II. As you can see here, the mic jack is very close to where the screen goes on the EM1 Mark III, whereas it's much more out of the way on the OM1 Mark II. It's above the level of the screen. However, the flaps seem more robust and sturdier on the EM1 Mark III. So in terms of accessing the flaps, I was charging the cameras once or twice a day via USB. Also, when I'm shooting macros, for example of mushrooms, I frequently lie the camera on the ground, resting on the flaps. So they do seem to get a bit of use and wear and tear. So between the better mic placement on the OM1 Mark II and the better, more robust feeling flaps on the EM1 Mark III, I call this one a draw. Now let's talk about the power switch. In my initial video, I said that I preferred the OM1 Mark II power switch because it is shorter and feels more robust. However, having used the cameras in the field, I have a confession to make. Sometimes when my hands are full with cameras, lenses, or even non-camera related equipment, I use my chin or even my bottom lip to turn the EM1 Mark III on. It's not possible on the OM1 Mark II switch, at least not for me. So perhaps my reasoning here is a bit unorthodox, but I would say now that I prefer the EM1 Mark III power switch. This came up a few times in Wales. And I know that you can remap the mode switch to be the power switch, but I like using the mode switch to put the camera into video mode, so it's not an option for me to use it as a power switch. Now let's talk about the mode switch itself. These are fine in both cameras. The EM1 Mark III switch is larger, but the OM1 Mark II switch is slightly easier to reach and change. So on balance, I probably give the win to the OM1 Mark II on this point. Now let's talk about the AF on button. Here the OM1 Mark II is better because it has a separate AF and AEL buttons. Having said that, although I never use AEL, I haven't actually mapped this spare button to anything else yet on the OM1 Mark II. So at the moment, it's more of a theoretical advantage. Finally, let's talk about the grip and the general feel. If I had to sum up the difference between the two cameras in terms of general feel, the EM1 Mark III feels smaller, sturdier, more rugged, more solid, more metal. The OM1 Mark II feels larger, more spacious, and more plastic. I do think it was a mistake by OM System to incorporate part of the battery door as part of the rear thumb grip on the OM1 Mark II. I like both cameras, but I definitely prefer the EM1 Mark III on this point. Because the Olympus cameras and lenses are relatively compact for their feature set, it is easy to carry them in a jacket or a raincoat pocket, which is how I prefer to carry them rather than in a separate camera bag. The EM1 Mark III is slightly easier to get in and out of a pocket this way. I think if I had slightly bigger hands, then I might prefer the larger size of the OM1 Mark II. But for me personally, I think the EM1 Mark III just suits my hands better. So let's conclude. Hardware-wise, I think the two cameras are pretty evenly matched if we go through the features I've covered. So the viewfinder, that's a clear win to the OM1 Mark II. Dials, that's a clear win to the EM1 Mark III. Battery, clear win to the OM1 Mark II. AF joystick, clear win to the EM1 Mark III. Ports, that's a win to the OM1 Mark II for the mic position and a win to the EM1 Mark III for the flap quality. So overall, that's a draw. Power switch, that's a win to the EM1 Mark III. Mode switch, that's a win to the OM1 Mark II. AF on button, that's a win to the OM1 Mark II. Grip and general feel, that's a win to the EM1 Mark III. Now perhaps the viewfinder and the battery are the decisive advantages of the OM1 Mark II over the EM1 Mark III. Whereas the dials and the AF joystick are the areas in which most people would probably consider the EM1 Mark III is better than the OM1 Mark II. Now, speaking personally, I'm happy to have upgraded to the OM1 Mark II. I'm making that judgment based on the camera overall rather than just the hardware. Something I've not talked about so far is the general upgrade in the speed of operation of the camera. I believe the processor in the OM1 Mark II has been upgraded over the EM1 Mark III. It certainly feels that way. The OM1 Mark II feels more future-proof than the EM1 Mark III. To give an example, Pro Capture is a feature I never use on the EM1 Mark III. While in Pro Capture mode, if you half depress the shutter button, the camera takes photos and holds them in the buffer. They only get saved to the memory card if you fully depress the shutter. However, on the EM1 Mark III, whilst you half depress the shutter, the viewfinder becomes jerky and laggy, and because of that, this has put me off using Pro Capture on the EM1 Mark III. However, on the OM1 Mark II, you can use Pro Capture without affecting the viewfinder. This enabled me to get a shot of a dolphin in Wales with the OM1 Mark II, which I never would have taken with the EM1 Mark III because I never would have attempted to take the shot in the first place. I don't claim that this is an outstanding wildlife photo, but given that I was sat on a harbour wall with essentially a manual focus lens and the dolphins were 500 or 600 metres away, popping out of the sea in unpredictable positions, I'm actually very pleased with this photo. And for me, it's a good example of the way the OM1 Mark II gives me an opportunity to grow and take the sort of photos I just wouldn't even attempt with other cameras. So that's the video. Hopefully you found it useful. If you have, please give me a like and a subscribe. I'm thinking of doing more camera content, possibly the other two parts of the comparison between the EM1 Mark III and the OM1 Mark II that I mentioned. And I might also do a video on the Sigma 150mm lens I mentioned, which is the lens I use to take the dolphin shot if there is any demand. So hopefully I'll catch you on the next video, and goodbye for now. And as always, if you've enjoyed this video, please do give me a like and a subscribe. Goodbye.